Good morning and good evening to everyone out there. My name is Woody Lowy, and welcome to the Kurious Ibex podcast, the podcast of falling far too deep into rabbit holes. This is the first episode of Lone Musings, the series in which I talk about things I think about when I'm alone and have some spare time on my hands. Today we will be discussing learning a language, in particular learning French and the challenges that come with it. French is known for being the language of France, obviously, but also perhaps the language of the province in Canada that people don't realize is significantly different from everywhere else in that country. It is also the language of about 11 of the 20 African countries that have been colonized by France. I truly began French when I was about 14, when the lessons actually pushed me hard enough that my brain was forced to retain information. The 2 years prior to that, my contentment with a mere passing grade meant that I never really needed to apply myself. I was conversational, let's say, by the end of high school, and through practicing with fluent or native speakers in university, I became fairly fluent leading into the semester where I went to Paris for an exchange program. This is where my French really blossomed into the level that it is at today, and that really demonstrates the power of being thrown into the linguistic deep end. French is a tricky language, especially I believe for English speakers. The phonemes are quite different from those in English, meaning that you can't use the same sounds to say a word aloud like you could with many words in Spanish, even without understanding what you're saying. On top of that, French has homonyms and homophones and phonemes that aren't immediately pronounceable for an English speaker, such as the re, and that all comes with different voice placements from those in English. Confused yet? Yeah, many might be. Not to mention the silent letters, and all that is just from the get-go. Breaking down the vowels, A, E, I, O, U, and Y, Y, which literally translates into Greek I, the pronunciations are not immediately clear. Even out of the three similar to their English counterparts, two, A and O, sound slightly different due to where the voice is placed when speaking French, which is, I suppose, what people would call the French accent. The first challenge when teaching French is, therefore, helping the students sound out the words. This is a crucial part of learning any new language, as being able to sound out words not only strengthens the relevant connections in the brain, but also really speeds up one's ability to pick up patterns, concepts, and basic communication capabilities. Imagine trying to learn Greek, but somebody had to not only translate what was in your textbook, but sound every word out for you as well. For those who care enough, or who want to know, that's called transliteration. It would take so incredibly long for you to progress, because you wouldn't be actively making connections between the script and the way the language sounds. I don't know what the second biggest challenge is, but I do know that a big challenge for people who don't speak a language that has gendered words is learning the gender. I believe that the struggle often derives from a place of seeing a word and its gender as separate entities, because, naturally, if your language has no such construction, you'll treat it as a foreign object. The way I see them and the way I prefer to teach students is to see the article, as in the, that in French denotes the gender of a word, as part of the word itself. An example would be, instead of saying feuille is leaf, and then trying to remember that it is feminine, learn it as la feuille, the leaf, which tells you it's feminine. Learn them like you would the names of a married couple, and over time your brain will pick up patterns for which words possess which gender. A complaint I often hear is that there are too many exceptions to the rules that are given by teachers at schools. I see this issue as I would a poorly constructed dichotomous key in phylogenetics. A dichotomous key is used to identify an animal based on its observable characteristics. It is essentially a series of binary questions that funnel you in a direction based on the way you answer them with the organism's visible traits. A poor dichotomous key would inevitably funnel you in the wrong directions, or pose questions that aren't binary and therefore do not help to narrow down your identification process. This is essentially most ways I've heard numerous students say their teachers have taught them about gender in French. One popular saying, if not the most popular saying, is, if it ends in a vowel, it is usually feminine. I have no idea who started this saying, but they really should be given a talking to for doing so. It is a massive, vast, and grotesque oversimplification. It doesn't even hold true in Spanish, which has one of the easiest gender identification systems in the world. If it ends in O, it's masculine, and if it ends in A, it's feminine. That's it. And yet the idea of a vowel making something feminine still doesn't work. But anyway, getting back to this whole if it ends in a vowel, it is usually feminine business. In French, you have words like père, which is masculine, and guerre, which is feminine, both of which end in an E. The reason such a rule is misleading right off the bat is because the usually caveat is going to be forgotten by beginners because it's generally far easier for them to remember hard and fast rules. Furthermore, since French is a language whose phonemes, as in a unit of sound in words, rely heavily on letter combinations, the rules of gender should be represented by such. For instance, words ending in age, age, are masculine. Think blocage, blockage, verrouillage, the locking of something, carrelage, tiling. Words ending in the shun sound in English or tion, sion, in French are feminine, such as condition, condition, or mastication, mastication. These are two rules, with no or significantly few exceptions. Another one would be that words ending with eau or au, both with the sound o, although the latter is a lot less common of a word ending, are masculine. Some examples include eau, water itself, réseau, network, and couteau, knife. Alright, one last one. Any ending with a doubled consonant and an E at the end is feminine, such as pomme, apple, gomme, eraser, terre, earth, gut, leek pan, or pen, quill. The lone exception here is verre, meaning glass. While teaching this way may seem more tedious, it provides rules that are clearer cut and are less frustrating than the simplified rule of thumbs that need you to remember the dozen exceptions that come with them. I'd much rather the tedium push positively for the student than for it to fight them. The other massive hurdle for English speakers, or speakers of any language that lacks similar constructions, is verb conjugation. Conjugation is the way a verb changes in form based on who is committing the action and when. While conjugations exist in English, and as much as many English speakers have no idea what they are and often get them wrong themselves, the variations of verbs within and between tenses are very limited, and make few distinctions in indicating who is speaking. For instance, in Spanish, the subject, meaning the I, you, or we, are often omitted in speech because the form of the verb changes uniquely for the subject and for the tense. So, instead of saying I read, they would just say read. The reason this omission doesn't work in French is mostly because of the homophones. Everything sounds the same. Okay, not everything, but too much sounds the same. Regardless, English does not have Spanish's unique constructions. For the verb to play, we have I play, you play, he plays, she plays, it plays, we play, you all play, they play. 2 forms in the present tense for 8 different subjects. This is why we cannot simply say playing video games, because no one would know who is playing. Spanish has yo juego, tú juegas, él, ella, usted juega, nosotros jugamos, vosotros jugáis, ellos, ellas, ustedes juegan. 6 distinct forms in the present tense for 10 subjects, and that's only because the conjugation for he, she, and formal you in both the singular and plural versions are the same. Therefore, I can just say juego, and people know that I am the one who plays. A large issue I see in the education of this concept is that it is presented as something just to be memorized. It's almost described as, "This is part of our language, so learn it." Singularly unhelpful. Rather, French teachers should be explaining that conjugations based on the subject help distinguish between who is doing the action. If this seems pointless, I can tell you firsthand that in languages such as Mandarin or Cantonese, The invariable sound ta or ko for he, she, and it definitely creates a lot of ambiguity at times. What about the conjugation for the tense? The teaching of this suffers much from the same problem as with the subject conundrum. The first thing students need to understand is why languages have tenses at all. Have you ever asked yourself that? Why do we have tenses? What purpose do they serve? The simplest answer is time. Tenses describe time. And the way tenses are structured in different languages reflect the way a certain culture may perceive time. Therefore, conjugated verbs indicate not only who is speaking, but when the action took place. I believe that this is a crucial idea to explain to language learners, because having them memorize tables of verbs without this concept feels like asking somebody to memorize binomial nomenclature without telling them what any of the organism's common names are. The reality is, however, that many of the same tenses exist in French and English, more so than, say, English and Italian, where the categories of their past tenses do not necessarily translate. For instance, in English, one could say, I had spoken to John before dinner, which indicates that dinner has already occurred and that you'd spoken to John before that point in time. French has the same construction, where j'avais parlé avec John avant le dîner, where avait is the conjugated form of avoir, to have, just as it is in English. I only wish that this similarity were brought to students' attention more frequently, as it would help them understand both languages better and give them an easier time. Now, before you go and call French idiosyncratic, which is really just a nice word for weird, I really must remind you of how many exceptions exist in the English language, which makes it so arduous for someone to learn. The rules for pronunciation itself in English derive from multiple languages, never mind the strangeness of someone trying to understand why drink, drank, drunk, sing, sang, sung, but bring, brought. English, while easy purely from the perspective of the number of conjugations, is not easy. All this I will perhaps dive into in another episode. I hope, however, that the elements that I have discussed elucidate some of the experiences French learners endure, and how the experience of an English learner may not be so different. One last thing. My debut book, the novella called 6 Tales of Wealth, is available on Amazon in paperback or for Kindle. If you enjoy short stories, westerns, and the frontier, please consider buying a copy. Any support is highly appreciated. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or follow the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Music, and please follow Kurious.Ibex on Instagram. This is Woody with the Kurious Ibex podcast. Until the next dive.